Your Honor, my sister is a leech. She didn't care for him, she harvested him. She sat by his bedside like a vulture waiting for the pulse to stop so she could strip the bones of this estate. Elena's lawyer leaned over the mahogany table, his voice dripping with practiced, oily indignation. My client, the rightful heir, was pushed aside by a caregiver who manipulated a dying man's medications to secure a signature. This isn't a trust, it's a heist. She is a glorified nursemaid who hijacked a $6 million legacy while my client was mourning. Elena let out a sob that sounded expensive and well-rehearsed. She took our last years with him, she wailed into a silk handkerchief. She wouldn't even let me say goodbye without checking her watch. She treated his home like a prison. The judge looked at me, his brow furrowed with growing distaste. Miss Ward, the allegation is that you exercised undue influence over a terminal patient to divert assets. Do you have a defense, or are we freezing these accounts? I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I simply rotated my wrist and checked the time. 10:02 a.m., not a defense, Your Honor, I said, my voice cutting through the emotional heat like a scalpel. Just a scheduled appointment. I'm waiting for the gatekeeper. The judge's gaze was heavy, but I didn't look away. My mind drifted back 15 years, to a kitchen that smelled of stale scotch and impending doom. I was 18, staring at a rejection letter from my dream university because the family fund had vanished. It's because of your reckless spending, my father had roared, slamming his hand on the table. That emergency surgery you needed in 10th grade? It drained the reserves. We had to pivot, and now the business is underwater because we had to carry your weight. It was a lie. A $10,000 medical bill doesn't sink a multi-million-dollar construction empire, but a narcissist needs a trash can for their shame. I was that trash can. For 15 years, that story was family lore. At every Thanksgiving, Elena would sip her vintage wine and remind me that I was the reason we lost the big house. I spent my 20s paying a debt that didn't exist. I stayed back, changing father's bandages and managing his erratic moods, while Elena sent postcards from Paris, funded by loans she never intended to repay. They called me a burden while I kept the lights on. They called me a leech while I was the only one preventing the bank from snapping the gates shut, but as I sat in that hard wooden chair today, I wasn't that 18-year-old girl anymore. I was the one who had run the numbers. I knew exactly where the money went. The heavy oak doors were pushed open with the tired efficiency of a man who spent his life in archives. A stranger walked in. He was not wearing the kind of Italian silk suit Elena's lawyer wore. He was wearing a gray off-the-rack number that was a size too big in the shoulders, and he carried a briefcase that looked like it had survived a war zone. But he did not look at the gallery. He did not look at Elena, who was craning her neck like a curious vulture. He walked straight to the clerk's desk, placed a thick sealed envelope on the wood, and turned to the judge. Your Honor, he said, his voice dry as dust. I am representing the Trust Department of Hawthorne National Bank. We are the successor trustee for the estate in question. The air in the courtroom changed instantly. It went from the sticky, emotional heat of Elena's performance to the absolute zero of corporate finance. Elena's lawyer stood up, his expensive chair scraping loudly. Objection. We have not been notified of any corporate trustee. Sit down, counsel, the judge said, not even looking up. He was already slicing open the envelope. The sound of tearing paper was the only noise in the room. The trustee did not rush. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of itemized spreadsheets, their edges crisp and terrifying. Your Honor, he began, his voice devoid of emotion, before we discuss the inheritance, we must address the outstanding liabilities of the petitioner, Elena Ward. Elena stopped crying. The sudden silence from her end of the table was more telling than her sobs had been. The trustee placed a document on the clerk's desk. Exhibit E, the lifestyle audit. For 5 years, the decedent did not just provide for his daughter, he acted as her involuntary creditor. He read from the ledger. May 14th, a $15,000 wire transfer for a business venture in Ibiza. July 22nd, $22,000 for a vintage car restoration that never occurred. September 30th, a $40,000 emergency loan for back taxes. He held up a copy of the trust's offset provision. Article 4, Section B states that any lifetime advances given to a beneficiary are to be deducted from their final share with 5% compound interest. As the numbers hit the air, Elena's $4 million share began to evaporate in real time. It wasn't a family feud anymore, it was a massacre of mathematics. He was not in his right mind. Elena's voice went shrill, the nuclear option finally deployed. He was senile, paranoid. This audit is a fabrication. She put a pen in a dying man's hand and forced him to sign away my future. The judge leaned over his spectacles. Miss Ward, you are formally challenging the competency of the grantor at the time these documents were executed? Absolutely, her lawyer stammered, seizing the momentum. We moved to suspend the trust's authority pending a full forensic psychiatric investigation into elder abuse. I gave the trustee a single, small nod. He didn't flinch. He simply pulled a final folder from his briefcase. Exhibit F, Your Honor. An affidavit of capacity signed by 2 forensic psychiatrists, completed 3 hours before the signing. Both found him oriented, lucid, and fully aware of his finances. The session was video recorded. In it, the decedent states he is protecting his legacy from Elena's insatiable greed. The silence that followed was suffocating. The judge's voice dropped to a cold, dangerous register. Article 9, Section C, the No Contest Clause. Any beneficiary who challenges the competency of the grantor shall immediately forfeit any and all interest in the trust estate. The trap had snapped shut. Elena didn't just have zero, she had effectively ceased to exist in the eyes of the law. The gavel fell with a finality that echoed through the nearly empty room. Elena sat paralyzed, staring at the empty space where her inheritance, and her identity, used to be. Her lawyer was already packing his bags, his expensive silk suit now looking like a shroud for a dead case. He knew exactly what had happened. By filing that petition, they hadn't just started a fight, they had pulled the pin on a grenade they were already holding. Outside, in the sterile, air-conditioned hallway, Elena lunged for my arm. Her eyes were wide and wet with a panic that wasn't grief, but the terrifying math of a lifestyle she could no longer afford. "You knew," she hissed. "You let me do this." I looked her dead in the eye, the same way I had watched the monitors during Father's final hours. "I told you to wait, Elena. You just didn't listen because you've never had to." I unlocked my car, the engine purring with a quiet, expensive precision. My sister was left standing on the curb, clutching a silk handkerchief that was now just a scrap of fabric. For 20 years, I was the burden. Today, the ledger was closed, and I wasn't paying the balance. I drove away, and this time, when she called, I didn't just ignore it. I hit delete.